Thank you. Thank you, Keith. I think I got off lightly there. Well, I'm going to talk about phenology and pruning times for tree species. And what I'm going to be talking about is what is perceived the best time for pruning certain species. And I'm going to give a few examples. There's not too much science in this talk. It's more about observations that I've made during my career at Kew and working with trees and actually putting that into practice. So this is Kew today, 320 acres. It's an incredible site. It's got a fantastic heritage landscape and an incredible legacy of botanic collections, tree collections, which I've been really privileged to be a custodian of and looking after all these years. It was formed in 1759 by Princess Augusta, and she wanted to have the best collection of trees in any other garden in Europe. So even then there was a bit of competition. Not saying we're competitive as tree growers, but you know, I'm going to boast that we have about 400 Trophy champions at Kew, which is the second most number of mature trees, biggest trees in Britain than any other garden. The first one is Hilliers, and they grow more cultivars than we do. We mainly concentrate on natural species that we've collected in the wild, so we know exactly where they come from. We have a collection of about 14,000 trees. Just over 2,000 different taxa, so that's different species, and as I say, mainly species, very few cultivars. And our shrub collections are just as important, 8,000 different accessions, there's a number of different plants or groups of plants under one number, and around 3,500 different species spread through the gardens, and it's laid out in family order. And the great thing about laying a collection out in family order is that you can monitor trees, you can look at tree species, and you can keep an eye on them, one species to another, of the same genus or the same family, without having to wander too much around the garden. So scientists love it because they don't have to do too much traveling and they don't have to do too much hunting when they're looking for different species. And it's laid out in family order, but of course that poses problems, particularly for pests and diseases. So if one tree, say for example, all the ash are together, if they're going to get Chalara or ash dieback, then inevitably they're all going to get that. So one of my jobs is to spread these around. I'm lucky because we have a good tree management system at Kew, which I developed in the 1990s, and then more recently I've refined it and developed it. We use TRAC, Tree Risk Assessment Qualification, as our risk assessment tool. And we call this system TRAMS, which is an acronym for Tree Risk Assessment Management System. And what I didn't want was a risk assessment system just devoted to risk assessments. We needed to get something a bit more out of it that we could use later on for scientific research, arboricultural research, and also monitoring collections, looking at pests and diseases. The great thing is that every arborist has a tablet, and as the trees are being inspected, mitigation work's being requested, that comes up on one of these screens, and you can see the color-coded that gives priority to work that needs to go on. And if the surveyor's out and he finds a tree with a defect that needs attending to quickly, then one of these, it will come up and it'll jump to the top and come up in red, priority. What also it does is we can decide and we can record when the actual date that we want tree work doing. I'm lucky I have my own team. We're not under pressure from commercial arboriculture, so we can go out and target tree work when we need to do it, or when we believe we need to do it, or when we would like to do it. And it's linked to Google Maps, so we can go out and find these trees pretty easily. And we're all on these tablets, and we can see what's happening and what's being done. And there are constantly new species coming through. That's one of my jobs as curator, is to bring new species into the collections and diversify the collections and look potentially for trees that could be more resilient for the future, for climate change or pests and diseases. And it's climate that I'm going to get onto. And just like Klaus Matek, this is Tilly, my Stupsy. She's my model because my wife refuses to do it now. And she poses for photographs for me. And we have at least an hour or two every morning walking around the Arboretum looking at trees. And these are two relatively new species, new kids on the block. The one on the right, Aesculus wangii, one of the buckeyes or horse chestnuts from Vietnam. Wangii meaning king of the horse chestnuts because it's got the biggest conker. So inevitably my son is a champion conker player at school. And this is, I call this a really miffy tree. It's a real moody tree. And if you start pruning it at the wrong time, it turns its toes up and it just gives up. And I don't know why, but what I have done, because this is the fourth one that I've planted now, is I've worked out the best time to do formative pruning on it, because it's still a relatively young tree. And then we have Wollomai pine that was discovered in 1994 in just northwest of Sydney, about 150 kilometres, thought to have been extinct 2 million years ago, suddenly reappears. And people say it won't grow in the UK, too dry, out of, away from the southern hemisphere. In the northern hemisphere, it's not going to do well. Actually, it's not a moody tree at all, and these are only about 10, 12 years old, and already they're starting to motor away. But as soon as you start pruning this tree, it stops. So it wants to be multi-stemmed. If you want it to grow, then you've got to let it do its own thing and let it become multi-stemmed. And the champion, the biggest of its kind in the gorge, has 40 stems. So, big tree. So what are the effects of pruning? We all know we have to prune, and we all know that when we prune trees, we do put some stress on them. So we reduce photosynthesis. We encourage epicormic growth from the trunk or the scaffolds. Potential energy reserves, carbohydrates are lost in cut branches, so the branches that we're cutting off, we're getting rid of carbohydrates that the tree will need. And valuable stored carbohydrates, we lose those that they would need to repair the pruning cuts that we're creating. And stress trees, we may weaken them, especially if we prune them at the wrong time by pruning and we make them more susceptible to microorganisms that invade trees through pruning wounds, etc. And then phenology. What is phenology? Well, this is a typical example. Phenology is a study of seasonal changes in plants and animals, a natural occurrence that happens from year to year, such as the flowering of plants, emergence of insects, migration of birds, mammals, etc. And especially timing the relationship with weather and climate. And certainly now, that's all changing, it's all moving, and things aren't as straightforward as they used to be. And biodiversity in trees, in woodlands, in gardens, is pretty mixed up at present. In Shigo's Modern Arboriculture, he says, he quotes phenology as the timing of natural processes, and that's a pretty simple definition of phenology. And at Kew, we have what we call the Q100. So we have 100 plants dotted through the gardens, and every year, so for the last, I think it's about 60, 70 years, we've recorded when they come into flower, or when they break bud, when they come into leaf, when they flower, when they fruit, and when they drop the leaves. And we can see changing patterns through the decades. We would normally look at the phenology as 4 seasons, so spring, summer, autumn, winter, and as I say, more recently, and certainly I've been at Q4 just over 40 years now, 41 years yesterday, and so feeling pretty old now. And I've noticed an incredible change in the seasons. I've noticed that we're going from 4 to 2 seasons. So autumn and winter sort of merge into one. We don't have that clear definition that we used to do. November, hard frost, total defoliation, all the trees are naked. Now That's moving on into December, and it's just a gradual change, and no real cold weather till January, February, if we're lucky. And then spring appears, and it's a bit of a surprise sometimes. Is it early? Is it late? And of course, the BBC are always wanting to know, is it early this year or is it late? And then that merges gradually into summer, and before we know it, everything's in flower, in leaf, and we seem to miss the change from spring to summer. And things get mixed up, particularly the trees. I'm going to show you something that Alex Shigo did in 1991. I'm sure we've all got these books, great books, and they tell us a lot. But Dr. Alex Shigo certainly talked a lot about phenology, and he said he did this circle, and he compared us as people, phenology in a day, so compared to a tree. So first of all, we wake up in the morning. Some of us a bit later than others. I'll not mention any names. We get dressed, we hope. We eat, we work, and then we go back to sleep. We go back and rest. And that's a typical cycle, a phenology cycle of us in a day. Shigo then looked at trees and compared it like for like. So number one, the tree wakes up in spring, onset of new growth. It forms leaves, it gets dressed. And then it eats, it feeds. And that's one of the most important parts of this circle, that high photosynthetic period. And then it goes to work. And it forms bark, wood, and stores energy. And then winter comes, and it goes back to sleep again. So I've shown you in a day what we do. That's in a year in the life cycle of a tree. And those numbers will move. If you had that as the 4 seasons, winter, spring, summer, autumn, that will almost be like a kaleidoscope and moving about on that circle, because we don't know when, autumn, I predict that autumn will be early this year because of the drought that we've had, certainly in London. But then I always get that wrong, and we'll have a lot of rainfall next week and the week after, and autumn goes on to November, and the television get really pissed off with me because all the film crews come in to film autumn colour and there isn't any. So I've never got it right. So don't listen to anything that I'm going to tell you. Some of you will know the Ashkenazi potential energy curve that Shigo talks about in his book. And this really came home to me. I did the PTI course with Guy Watson, the Lantra PTI course. It's a great course. Guy, you owe me a drink. And I remember him showing me this curve and talking about it. And it took a while to sink in, but then it really came home to me how important this curve was. It was developed by a Russian fruit researcher many years ago, but Shigo picked up on it. And the energy levels of a tree are up here on the left-hand side, from low to high energy levels, and then the seasons along the bottom here, from January through to December. And I'll superimpose Shigo's the phenology circle. So number one, the tree wakes up. Maybe about March into April. Again, this curve is going to move. It's dynamic, but the tree starts to grow. Onset of growth. The buds break. It's producing new leaves. And then we get down to the bottom here, number 2, and this is where the trees form in the new leaves. And you can see that the energy levels in the tree have really dropped down to low energy levels. And then as we climb back up that curve, the tree's feeding, high photosynthetic period, and it's starting to work hard and produce the sugars and starches and carbohydrates that it needs to function. And that's climbing up now, up through that 3. And then 4, it's starting to work. It's forming new bark, forming new wood, and it's starting to grow. And then as we go further along, we go into dormancy. So when a tree's dormant, it has high energy levels because it's stored all those carbohydrates that it's produced that it knows that it needs. And as we heard earlier, trees are smart. Trees know what they have to do, and we need to trust them. And that's what they're doing here. But what you'll notice is that 3, as that graph starts to climb in that period, that line there is probably the best time to start pruning trees. I know that we have to prune trees at certain times because we're commercial, but if you have trees that you need to take a little bit more care and attention of, and trees that are stressed or young moody trees, then that's the time, one of the optimum times for pruning, when the tree has the potential to cope with that. So some of the trees that I'm just going to show you some examples of trees that do prefer summer pruning, and I'm going to come on to bleeding and sap leakage, etc. in a minute. But some of the trees that prefer, that I've noticed, that if you prune them in the winter, the wrong time of the year, then they start to produce cankers and die back and never really perform. This is Corylus fargesii, and it's one of the hazels. It's one of the tree hazels. It's got flaky bark, and I think for me, that would determine to me that these flaky bark species would prefer summer pruning. And I've seen trees of Corylus that have been pruned in winter, in midwinter, and then they've just really struggled the following year and produced lots of dieback and cankers in the stems. Aesculus turbinator, and I've put turbinator in just as an example, but Aesculus, some of the Aesculus species, again, prefer summer pruning, and I've got better results doing formative pruning and structural pruning by doing that in the height of summer rather than waiting for the winter. And of course the snakebark maples. I've just put this one in Acer tegmentosum, the amber maple. But most of the snakebark maples, Acer davidii, rufinervae, tegmentosum, etc., they do. Pennsylvanicum is another one that prefer summer pruning. So after that line of 3. Now, of course, there's some trees that we know bleed, and there's a joke, isn't there, for arborists. I wanted to be an arborist, but I couldn't stand the sight of sap. And I think in the US we call it sap leakage. But this is when the pressures of sap are running up the stems, and we make a cut, and it's basically like turning the tap on, and the sap leaks out of the pruning wounds. And birch is a classic example. Certainly maples, and I'll list some species in a minute that are more prone to this. Of course, it's used commercially for maple syrup production, birch bark wine, etc. The Jubea palm for Jubea wine in Chile. So commercially we have cottoned onto that, and we realise that we can get that material by wounding the tree at I'll say the wrong time of the year as an arborist, but the right time of the year if you're collecting that sap. And then trees like Morris nigra, they'll leak a latex, a horrible rubbery thing. So not only are you going to get sap leakage of this latex dripping off, but when you get it on you, then it contaminates your clothes, your hands, etc. And in a public garden like Kew, we get claims for anything like that. If people get it on their clothes, then they're going to come back and they want either free entrance or new clothes. So we have to be a bit careful. And of course, if we cut things like Rus trichocarpa, Rus viniciflua, the lacquer tree, then we're creating a real hazard, because that is highly toxic sap that some of us will be very, very susceptible to, and will get blistering on us. So we have to wear the right PPE when we're pruning trees like that. Juglandaceae, for me, is the one that I always use at Kew when I'm doing demonstrations and I want to get a tree to bleed. If it's the right time of the year to get it to bleed, then I know that if I cut a walnut, I can get it bleeding within a couple of minutes. and it starts with a drip, just leakage, and then a drip, and then I've actually seen it where it's running out like a hose pipe, and it can be quite daunting if you're not used to seeing that. And just here on the left, this is a champion. Well, it's not the champion, but it's a county champion of Juglans Niagara, a fantastic specimen planted in the 1760s. Imagine if you did pruning cuts all over this about March time, or even February, then you'd get wet walking under it. And there's nothing you can do. The old wives' tale is, rub soil on the cut and that'll stop it. Well, it doesn't. It just makes a mess. You have to live with it, and it will actually stop itself. And you have to be used to that. But all Juglandaceae, so Terra carrier, the wingnuts, carrier, the hickories, and I haven't put platycarrier up here, but platycarrier is another one in Juglandaceae that will bleed and leak sap. So here's just a few other trees. I'll not go through them all, but certainly Acer, Betula, Carpinus, carrier. I mentioned carrier and Juglans, laburnum, magnolia, the deciduous spring flowering types, morris, we've talked about that, poplars can bleed, and sophora, I'm not sure about Stiphnalobium now, but certainly sophora will do sap leakage, and vines, and actually what we do with vines in glass houses as horticulturalists, we have the long rods, and to get sap to the end, because we prune all the laterals off to get a crop, we literally untie it and tip the end down lower than the root system, so we can really speed up the sap run down to the end, so we get a full living sap-filled rod. And I suppose the longer you do the rod, the longer you have to leave it down to fill that. So we've looked at leakage, sap leakage, and bleeding. I want to look at pests and diseases because we talk about rosaceae. It's probably one of the most questions I get. When is the best time to prune my cherry or my fruit trees? And laburnums, poplars are the same. The rhododendrons, they can all suffer from silverleaf. So silverleaf is Chondrosterium purpureum. Silverleaf is the symptom, but that's the fruiting body. So it's purple, but the silverleaf comes from the silver leaves that is a symptom of the disease. And cherries pretty susceptible to this. So the best time to prune these is when the spores of Chondrosterium are inactive, so that's around July, August. That would be the best time for pruning fruit trees or rosaceae, and particularly decorative rosaceae. We need to start thinking out of the box as well. So there are things that we don't have yet, but we've heard several times yesterday and today about pests and diseases that are on the horizon that are looking to come to us. And God, we don't want them, because when I was at Maris Wood in 1976, 77, the only thing we were looking at was Dutch elm disease. Nothing else mattered. There was nothing, and honey fungus. Now, that curve we saw yesterday is just shooting up. And as we heard, there are more pests and diseases today, this century, than the whole of the 20th century, and we're only less than 20 years into it. So, and we do know, because of the horizon scanning that we were doing, what is out there and what is waiting to come in. And one of them is the bronze birch borer. We don't have it. I'm sure Ed has lots of experience with bronze birch borer. So in the States, a lot of birches are grown multi-stemmed, so that if a stem's infested by a borer, then they can take one of the stems out and we're not losing a tree, rather than it being on a single stem. But the bronze birch borer has a really good nose. It can smell the sap of birches, and it hones in on that smell. So, should bronze birch borer come into this country, then we need to be leaving pruning. We shouldn't be pruning between May and July when the bronze birch borer is active and flying. And I think that one of the policies, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ed, but is to avoid excessive pruning, so you're not giving off that scent, and never to do more than 25% thinning on a birch. So that's thinking ahead, should we get bronze birch borer. And then oak wilt. I think we've had it, and it's been cleared, it's gone, but it's inevitable that, you know, we will get it. Sweet chestnut blight we all thought we wouldn't get that, and that's raising its head every now and again. And we all hope that we don't get oak wilt. We've enough with oak processionary moth, we've enough with acute oak decline, with oak mildew, with grey squirrels, with parakeets. We do not want oak wilt. And it affects the red oaks. So Quercus rubra, palustris, coccinea, velutina, those are the ones that it targets. And there are strict regulations in many states in the US about pruning operations on red oaks, when you can and when you can't prune red oaks. And the best time to prune is between autumn and spring, never between spring and late summer. So that goes against the number 3 principle. So we're going to number 5, where the energy reserves are good. Because the insects are attracted to it, or insects are attracted to the sap that then become vectors and move oak wilt from one infected tree to a healthy tree. And dare I mention oak processionary moth? Sorry, Henry, you'll be itching. We've had so much experience of this at Kew now, and it's become a real problem for my arborists. It's pretty smart. It can read labels. So the one way that you could fool it is by changing the label and see if that dissuades them. But they only feed on European oaks, and I only know of one oak, Quercus alba, so a North American oak that it's been feeding on, and that's because it's in the Rober section. So it's very closely akin to the English oak. But you can see it there in procession, going along the branch, usually on the underside, so it's good for detecting. But you can see all this silk. This is what they weave their nests with. And after it has 6 instars, and after the 6th instar, the hairs on it become toxic, and it uses those hairs with the silks that it weaves to build nests that it lives in. And Henry and I were just talking at lunchtime, because every now and again, every 5 or 7 years, if it's not managed well, you get a population explosion. And I went to see Henry in the Netherlands, and he showed me population explosions. These are all nests, OPM nests, in a Quercus rober. and that is full of hairs with barbs that are toxic. So if you send your arborists up through there without PPE on, then you're in trouble. And even when the caterpillar's not active, but the nests are there and the hairs are there, they're around, they persist for about 5 years, and they just stay lodged there in the bark of the tree. Then they'll come off in your clothes, and then they'll do this. And that's gone through a polo shirt and caused that rash that he had for 6 weeks. Luckily, you can cover it, you can put cream on it, but if it gets on your neck or exposed parts of your body and the sun comes out, then it aggravates. So when is the best time to prune oaks now in an OPM zone? And Kew is right in the middle of an OPM zone, and of course it's spreading. It's moving pretty rapid now. It's out to the M25. We're pretty clean at Kew now because we have a program of spraying each year. So we do a prophylactic spray before we see it and before it becomes a problem. However, we do have small outbreaks up in the canopies of trees. So now our oaks, we wait till they're totally dormant. The caterpillars are around from April through to June, so you definitely would not be wanting to climb in oaks during that period. then we would wait till it's dormant, and they'll wear PPE now when working in oak trees. So we need to look at those times. So summer pruning, we use that as well for restricting growth on trees, particularly fruit trees. So July into early August is when we're doing all our restrictive pruning. Things like spaliers, cordons, small bush trees, pyramids, etc. We're pruning back to prevent the tree from pruning vegetative growth and encouraging fruit growth. And we'll do that, as I say, in summer. And of course, let's not forget decorative vines like the wisteria. So July into early August, we're cutting those wispy, those long shoots back that it's produced that year, back to 5 buds, to stop it producing any more vegetative growth, and forcing the buds below that into making flower buds. And then we'll go back in February, and if we're brave, we'll prune those back to 3 buds, sometimes 2, to guarantee having good flower buds on the tree. And I put this in for Ted. I had to, we have to think about veteran trees, and I took this out of the Veteran Trees, a guide to good management. And you can see along the bottom here, this is out of the, showing the best time to work on veteran or ancient trees or stress trees. The best time is, where are we? Yeah, so not good, April, May, June, possible June, July, August, not good again September, October, but November, December, better. And actually that should be three asterisks. So this is the best time. And I've not done work on veteran trees, Vicky, so I'm out to preserve trees rather than wrecking them. So yeah, and I hate sap streams. And the other one is thinking about wildlife and the Wildlife and Countryside Act 1981. Nesting birds have a right to nest in hedgerows, etc. So it's illegal to damage a bird's nest. So we have to get our timing right for hedge cutting, etc. Pleaching is another one where we get lots of birds nesting. So we have to think about the biodiversity that goes in a garden and respect it and look after that. And finally, because Ed showed his books, mine's in there as well. This one has, the latest book has a lot more about pruning times in the A to Z, with all the different genera and as many species as I could list based on my observations at Kew. Thank you.